didn't see your thumbs up, but now I've brought them back up. Cool. Well, hello everyone. It's lovely to meet you all. Thank you for joining me here for this talk on a Saturday, and thank you to Alex for inviting me to come and speak to you today. So here's the plan for what we're going to cover today. Briefly, I'm going to explore some of the available evidence about the impacts of climate change and how EA has handled this evidence. And then I'm going to talk about some reasons why I think the impacts of climate change are worse than the evidence used by EA. And finally, I'll talk about the ways in which EA struggles to engage with climate change, and close by offering an answer to the question that titled this talk. So firstly, a little bit about who I am. I'm Martin. I've been working as a software engineer since 2008. I currently work at Amazon. I became interested in effective altruism back in 2017 and started advocating for it at work. I became interested in climate in 2019 and spent part of my spring last year doing loads of research to put together my own talk, which I then presented at work and published externally. In the same year, I got involved in Extinction Rebellion, XR, who are an originally UK-based climate protest group, although they've now got branches really all over the world. And I'm currently an internal coordinator for their Heading for Extinction talk working group, which has been really interesting to get to see firsthand a group trying to figure out how to best communicate the science of climate change and holding that science to a really high bar. At the end of last year, I wrote 2 EA forum climate posts. Initially, my first post was about the fact that I thought that the 80,000 hours cause profile for climate change was out of date and inadequate in some ways. And so I posted a critique along with a proposal of what a better profile would look like. One of the comments I got on that post said, hey, this critique is interesting, but what I really want to see is whether climate change interventions are more valuable than other interventions such as global health. And so I did a second post where I reviewed the existing estimates in that area and critiqued them, and essentially concluded that they really weren't great. They were quite weak, and that I thought the best that we could say was that action on climate change was probably at least as effective as action on global poverty and health, and likely more effective. And then ahead of this talk, I put together a new post which I titled "Climate Change is Neglected by EA," which was me arguing one side of the question posed in this meeting. And this year, on the back of taking such an interest in this topic, I'm shifting my career. I'm actually taking on a new role at Amazon starting in June to do work that is actually, I hope, going to help reduce emissions, essentially. So I'm quite excited about that. But a thing I want to say up front is that I should be clear from this. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a software engineer who spent some time reading a few books and quite a few academic papers, but you should treat what I say cautiously. It's entirely possible that I've made some mistakes, and I would love to find out what these are. So if you spot them, great. That would be very good. So I want to start this talk by reminding you all of the hugely diverse set of impacts which climate change will have on humanity, and this is definitely not a complete list. There are a range of direct impacts, all of which have distinct geographical impacts. And these produce a range of indirect effects. Many of these effects can be expected to interact negatively with each other. For example, changing weather patterns will likely reduce agricultural productivity, which will have a direct impact on health and an indirect effect on poverty, which will have further health impacts. Syria, as a case in point, was in drought for the 5 years up to 2011, which pushed 2 or 3 million people into extreme poverty. and it's thought that this was a contributor to the breakout of the Syrian civil war that's been in our news ever since. Just taking a moment to really genuinely appreciate the deeply interconnected set of climate impacts is really important to give your critical eye when reading research on climate impacts, which often only examine a small fraction of this picture. So, based on currently announced policies around the world, we're on track for a world that will warm somewhere between 2.3 and 4.1 degrees Celsius by 2100. So you would hope that we would have some understanding of what that world is going to look like. But the sad reality is that we really don't have much of a great understanding of what that world will look like. It wasn't until 2009, when there was the first 4 Degrees and Beyond conference, that some dedicated work was done on researching what a 4 degrees or worse world would actually look like. The latest IPCC report, AR5, came out in 2014. And then in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was created, one outcome was a specific request to the IPCC to produce a report about the difference in impact between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of warming. This amazingly had never been rigorously studied before, and this report, SR15, came out in 2018. Now, back in 2015, the UK government actually published a climate risk assessment, and that basically concluded that we don't know what the impact of a 4 degrees Celsius world will be, and that it may be impossible to accurately model what that world will be like. I find that upsettingly kind of plausible, because climate change is pushing the world into fundamentally unknown territory. Our species showed up about 400,000 years ago. We started farming and building settlements about 20,000 years ago. In the last 800,000 years, the level of CO2 has never climbed above 300 parts per million. So our species has simply never existed in a climate like the one we are creating. The last time CO2 levels were in the range 300 to 400 parts per million, below where we are now, was 3 million years ago. Temperatures at that time were 2 or 3 degrees Celsius warmer, and sea levels were at least 15 meters higher. So, given that there's such little evidence, such a lack of concrete evidence about the impacts of particularly bad climate change, how has EA dealt with this? So, EA has tried to use the available evidence to quantify the expected impact of climate change. In the next few slides, I want to discuss the most likely sources you'll see being relied on by EAs to do this. I'll also talk about some of the shortcomings of these sources. So firstly, this 2014 World Health Organization report is a common source that you'll often see used. It produced estimates of incremental climate-related deaths across 6 areas. However, the report itself calls out many important limitations in the research. Just to take an example, the malnutrition modeling doesn't account for increases in extreme weather events, sea level rise, changes in water demand, increases in pests and diseases, loss of income from land which becomes unproductive. And that's a quote from the report. The World Health Organization report was used in a key Effective Altruism climate cost effectiveness estimate back in 2016 by Giving What We Can. The Giving What We Can estimate doesn't use the coastal flooding mortality estimates, as the World Health Organization report only forecasts these within broad ranges. They estimated that the level of mortality would be between 10 and 30,000 people a year. And because the bands were so broad, between 2030 and 2080, which were the 2 periods that it looked at, the estimate didn't change. And because the Giving What We Can estimate cared a lot about changes in impact, it just ignored that entirely. Another example, the World Health Organization estimated that malaria deaths are likely to decline between 2030 and 2050, and that's specifically climate-attributed malaria deaths. Now, that kind of makes sense because we hope that the world is going to get wealthier in that time period. So even whilst more people would be subjected to malaria, as long as they were getting wealthier, they'd be able to better protect themselves from malaria. And so the number of climate-attributed malaria deaths would come down. But Giving What We Can estimate took this result and treated that as if climate change between 2030 and 2050 was driving a reduction in malaria deaths. And therefore, if there was less climate change, there would be less reduction, which seems kind of absurd, but that was one of the assumptions baked into this 2016 estimate, just to give a feel for how this evidence has been treated. And there's more critique that I have for that particular estimate, but I've got a whole post about it, so I won't go into more detail about that. Another way that people try and quantify the impact of climate change is through what's known as a social cost of carbon. This is an estimate produced by economists where they try and price in the total cost of emitting 1 extra ton of carbon. What are all the kind of costs to society of doing that? However, before relying on social cost of carbon estimates, which are usually built on top of integrated assessment models, I would strongly recommend you read the 2 papers which I've quoted on this slide. They're both quite readable, and I'll just quote briefly from the Pindyck paper, who's got some pretty scathing criticism of integrated assessment models. This is quoted: "In a recent article, I argued that integrated assessment models, quote, have crucial flaws that make them close to useless as tools for policy analysis, end quote. In fact, I would argue that calling these models close to useless is generous. IAM-based analyses of climate policy create a perception of knowledge and precision that is illusory and can fool policymakers into thinking that the forecasts the models generate have some kind of scientific legitimacy. IAMs can be misleading and are inappropriate as guides for policy, and yet they have been used by the government to estimate the social cost of carbon and evaluate tax and abatement policies." End quote. That's pretty damning. Like this is I think Pindyck is an economist, and he's basically saying just don't use these. These are just terrible. And he's got a much longer explanation of that I didn't just want to read out, but is in his use and misuse of models for climate policy. Basically putting it into my own words, a social cost of carbon is our best estimate of the total cost to society of each emitted ton of carbon. But these estimates are hugely influenced by arbitrary and unverifiable choices in the modeling process, because we're trying to model the behavior of a complex system, the world, in states that we have never been able to observe it in before, because it's never had 10 billion people in a 4 degrees Celsius world with 80 more years of technology development. Like, of course that's a hard thing to predict. Related to this IAM modeling, Danny Bresler is a PhD candidate in Columbia University's Sustainable Development Program. He estimated in 2019 that by 2100, there would be a cumulative 76 million additional deaths from now caused by climate change, with a rate by the end of the century of 2.18 million people a year dying. Now, it's worth noting these are early unpublished results from his PhD. But the kind of interesting thing to note is that he's doing this work because he points out that leading integrated assessment models don't account for climate mortality, both in terms of reduced labor force and the basic value of human lives lost. That's kind of incredible to me that in 2019, there's a PhD candidate doing novel work being essentially looking at, I wonder if it would change the social cost of carbon if we actually accounted for all the people that will die from climate change, and then attempts to model those deaths and falls into all the usual traps of, like, it's very hard to model the future, but still manages to come out with a number that materially changes the social cost of carbon produced by the I think it's the DICE IM model, which I think it's the Nordhaus, the economist who's won a Nobel Prize for producing it. Like, this is the state of the art that we're trying to build our estimates on top of. This is the last one that I'm going to be critiquing. So in 2019, Impact Lab produced a paper where they tried to model the direct impact of temperature on mortality. Basically, what they were trying to do is they were looking at if you get, for example, one more 35 degrees Celsius day rather than a 20 degrees Celsius day, how many more people die? And you can look at that on like a per region basis. And like if you take a particular city and compare year by year by year, some years have more hot days than other years. And so you can look at the years with more hot days and say, oh, more people died. And therefore you can come up with a mathematical function which says when you get more hot days, you get more people who die. And they predict that 1.5 million people a year will be dying by 2100 just from increased heat. And remember, there are many other effects involved here. But it's far from clear to me that the observed mortality-temperature relationship will actually hold in the actual weather patterns expected from climate change. For example, in more prolonged heat waves. Like, the scope of what they did is impressive. It's impressive that they split down the world into 24,000 distinct geographical regions. They got data on all of those regions. They processed it. They wrote this paper, and it's still nowhere near what we would need for this to be plausible to me. So I want to put these mortality figures in context because, like, I certainly, before I looked into a lot of these things, had never looked at, for example, how many people die every year in the world. And that's an important number to know to put some of these numbers in context. So today, roughly, there are about 60 million people who die a year. And by 2100, that'll about double, largely due to population growth. And that's like, we're all going to die. And so 120 million deaths a year is not some failing. That's largely, that's what a kind of relatively stable population looks like towards the end of this century. But as of right now, in a world where we've got about 60 million people dying a year, the top three causes are cardiovascular, cancers, and respiratory. And selecting a few other causes from a bit further down the list, we've got diarrheal diseases at 1.5 million a year, diabetes at 1.3 million a year, and road injuries at 1.2 million a year. Now, I've just been mentioning a couple of mortality figures, and I said that Danny Bresler estimated 2.1 million deaths a year in 2100, and Impact Lab estimated 1.5 million deaths a year in 2100. So I think a comparison you could make, a comparison that I've heard be made in the EA context, is to say, oh, actually, it looks like climate change might be basically as bad as road traffic accidents by the end of the century. Like, very bad. It would be great if we didn't have it, but like, as soon as you make that comparison, at least to me, that sounds very trivializing. I hear that and I'm like, oh wait, I've got something wrong here. I'm clearly been overestimating climate change. Like, I wish 1.2 million people a year weren't dying from road injuries, but like, that's clearly not destroying civilization as I know it. So everyone who's talking about civilizational collapse, they must just not really be getting on board with these numbers. But like, I think this is just grabbing at the like limited estimates that we have and connecting them up to these figures and making just deeply invalid comparisons. They're genuinely the best comparisons that we can make, but the estimates that we're comparing, I don't think are terribly valid. And as I started this talk by saying, the impacts of climate change are much broader than just mortality, and you always have to come back to that. And so I don't think it's sufficient to be like, oh, it's probably just like road traffic accidents. This is going to be quite a brief slide. I guess in the EA context, I just wanted to acknowledge that EA has repeatedly considered the question of whether climate change is an extinction risk. And That's a very important question, given that there's a large group of effective altruists who are very worried about the long-term future of humanity. And extinction is a kind of unique event in that it's a thing you can't come back from. Um, and so if climate was an X risk, like a genuine it's going to wipe out all of us risk, that would afford it special consideration. I think I'm probably of the view that it's not an X risk. I haven't seen evidence that it truly is, but often the reviews that come to this conclusion in an EA context fall into all the traps we've been talking about, and so I think the gap between climate and X risk is probably narrower than is generally viewed, but I think it is a bit implausible that it would really wipe all of us out. It's merely going to cause a larger amount of harm, an incredibly large amount of harm in my opinion. So what are the important features of climate change which I think EA should focus on that I think makes climate such a like difficult and challenging and interesting problem? So first up, it's the fact that CO2 emissions persist for hundreds of years. Again, we don't really know because we've never put this much CO2 into the atmosphere and seen what happens. It could be into thousands of years, but I'm saying conservatively it's at least hundreds of years. And so for many intents and purposes, that's effectively permanent in the short to medium term. And unlike many other cause issues, like if we don't make malaria better, if we don't address malaria, it's not likely to get much worse 50 years from now, except climate will probably make it worse, but let's put that to one side for a second. Whereas climate change, every ton of CO2 we put in the atmosphere it's changing the atmosphere of the planet, and that persists, and we will be reaping the consequences of that for a very long time. So, and like the way that often gets phrased is in terms of carbon budgets. There's this idea of there's a certain amount of carbon that we can emit before we are effectively committing ourselves to a certain level of warming. And so the key thing is that we are rapidly approaching emissions thresholds, which will commit us to unprecedented levels and rates of warming. Like we're talking within the next 10 years, and it arguably has already passed, we will have committed ourselves to exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Like this is an immediate and present concern about whether or not we are committing future generations to particular levels of warming. The diverse impacts of climate change are likely to reinforce each other in ways which are incredibly difficult to model ahead of time. And then taking a couple of key points to just kind of exemplify the kinds of impacts which I think don't really get talked about in EA reviews. So in 2019, there were 71 million displaced people worldwide. That's refugees who were forced to leave their country and internally displaced people who were forced to move around in their country due to things like civil war. That's 71 million. In the coming decades, it is likely that climate change will displace hundreds of millions of people. That will be due to things like shifts in climate, increases in sea level. This will be a relocation of people larger than anything humanity has ever dealt with. This seems very likely to be extremely costly, and yet it's a very hard thing to model, because how will populations move around? Will people break out into, will countries break out into conflict? It's very hard to know. And so it's very poorly evidenced and very poorly examined in these like cost effectiveness analyses. Taking another key point, in 2012, Superstorm Sandy made landfall in New Jersey, bringing with it a 9-foot storm surge. That's a 3-meter surge in sea level. Events like this are going to become more common. Sea level rise since 1950 has already doubled the chance of a Sandy level storm surge. By 2100, Sandy level storm surges are likely to occur roughly annually along the east coast of the US. It's expected that this will wipe out coastal cities like Miami and Atlantic City. Like, this is, yeah, I find that kind of expected transformation of the world shocking and amazing that it doesn't get more kind of more widely talked about. I struggle to like, I have yet to figure out the right kind of utilitarian calculus for adding in QALYs and also forcing everyone in Miami and Atlantic City and many East Coast US cities, and in fact many cities around the world, to move. Like, I am certain that because climate change is happening relatively slowly, many people will adapt. But is it acceptable that we're forcing that many people around the world to adapt by leaving their homes and forming new cities further inland? Is that okay? I also want to point out a key reason why I think limiting warming is going to now be so hard. The Paris Agreement was to limit the average global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit this increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, almost all of the pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius rely on a massive deployment of negative emissions technology. Looking at the figures on this slide, if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are likely committing to building negative emissions technology with the same absorption capacity as the entire planet. Like, that's absurd. The planet absorbs about 20 gigatons of CO2 a year right now, and the SR15 pathways assume some of them up to 20 gigatons a year of negative emissions technologies by 2100. And negative emissions technologies have never been deployed at scale. And so the pathways that we are committing to rely on us being able to have a technology by the end of the century that has CO2 absorption on planetary scale. I mean, so 80 years is a long time of technology development, but I don't know that I want to bet on us definitely cracking that. We've been talking about nuclear fusion for a long time, and that's a hard, complicated problem that seems always 10 years away from being cracked. What if negative emissions technologies at scale is a hard, complicated problem that's always 10 years away from being cracked? It doesn't get to be that. So I think there are 4 key reasons why climate change fits in poorly with EA. I think there is a lack of evidence of the more severe impacts for all of the reasons that I've been talking about. And there's questionable handling of that evidence by effective altruists. Climate is certainly not neglected by the world. Like, there's lots of people working on it, there's lots of money going into it, and so EA doesn't want to promote it because on the margin, it's not something where you throw one extra person at it and we're going to crack it. Maybe. And EA tends to focus on the X-risk side of climate change because EA as a movement has a large subgroup who are very worried about X-risk. There's definitely at least the impression that when climate is classified as not an X-risk, it's therefore, it's not as interesting to EA. And fundamentally, climate change is just incredibly hard to model, and emissions are committing humanity to a particular path, which is unlike many other problems. Like, if I'm choosing between malaria interventions or deworming interventions, like, I can pick them, and it's a reasonably like clear-cut choice based on evidence. If I'm choosing between malaria and climate, you're asking me to choose between something which is well quantified, and you're asking me to then predict the future. And also, by the way, the work you're doing on malaria might in fact be undone by climate change. So a week ago, I made a post about a lot of this to the EA forum. I got a few quite helpful pieces of feedback on my EA forum post, along with some more skeptical responses, which I was expecting. I think it's worth noting that by the EA definition of neglectedness, climate is simply not neglected. And so In my post, I try and make the argument that, well, maybe we're defining neglectedness wrongly, but I think the pushback that I got, and perhaps rightly so, is that EA has a particular view of what neglectedness is, and it's not very helpful to kind of ram in other things to that definition. Like maybe what we need is a different word, and I haven't got a proposal, but like a different word to describe problems which are not neglected in terms of effort, but neglected in terms of results. I think it's also really helpful and important to break down climate change into more specific cause areas. Like climate as a whole is clearly not neglected, but maybe negative emissions technology research is genuinely neglected, or maybe there are other specific sub areas which are neglected. It's sort of like looking at global health and saying, oh, well, there's lots of people working in global health, therefore it's not neglected, when maybe there are particular conditions like malaria or deworming where there are interventions which are effective. And I think it's worth, I think it's actually quite important to acknowledge that the title of this talk was "Is Climate Neglected by EA?" And I have clearly presented a pretty biased, one-sided picture on the evidence. And I did that in my forum post as well, and was rightly called out for that because I was arguing not like both sides of it. I wasn't engaging in debate. I was arguing a particular side of a debate. And that's not ideal. Like that asks your audience to go off and be like, okay, they're saying all this stuff, but what are the counter arguments? And so if we want to engage in these kinds of debates, it would be helpful, and I wish I had in my post, presented both sides just a little bit more. Because EA has not been entirely ignored by, sorry, climate change has not been entirely ignored by EA. There's some really good work going on within EA on climate change, but I think the argument which I'm arguing, and I would stick by, is that some of the way that EA engages with climate evidence is, if I was going to be blunt, superficial and naive, and that from an X-risk perspective, there's a bit like, it's an important question, but that then becomes a bit of a key part of the EA narrative around climate is it's not an X-risk. Don't worry, it's not an X-risk. You don't need to worry about it because it's not an X-risk. So is climate change neglected? Well, global emissions need to be declining rapidly. That hasn't even started yet. On this basis, it seems obvious that much more remains to be done. Is climate change neglected by EA? I think it is. I think it's not being ignored, and there's some good work happening, but we've just been far too willing to take the limited evidence that does exist and use it to draw, I think, some really questionable conclusions, despite there being huge caveats alongside that evidence, or in the like academic literature surrounding that evidence about what you can or cannot say based on those studies that have been done. And that's it. That's all that I had prepared for today. So I will stop sharing, and I would now love to take any questions or discussion.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Martin. Interesting stuff. And if it'd be all right, I think some questions would be great. I think I did have. I was actually curious if you wouldn't mind. You mentioned that when like basically some U.S. cities will likely be flooded, Miami and Atlantic City, and you mentioned like you haven't found yet like maybe that many ways to look at the qualities of like how that would be when people are displaced. What have you found, if anything, with any studies? Is there anything that has touched upon that at all, or what's been your experience with that?
No, to my knowledge, there is nothing. Like there's academic research looking at impacts of things like sea level rise. So there will absolutely be academic studies who will be making things like predictions of Miami being flooded, etc., and other cities around the world being flooded. But often the academic research will, as far as I'm aware of it, will get as far as predicting those impacts. They won't take it the next utilitarian step, which EA often wants it to be taken, which is, cool, how do we quantify that in a kind of quality type metric way? I think, as far as I'm aware, that's just absent.
Thank you. Yeah, I do see that there was a comment in the chat. I'm not sure if it's a question I need to come up with.
Yeah. So I don't know if the person who made it wants to say something.
I'm happy to quickly jump in on that.
Yeah.
So I do work on climate change, and I have a lot of colleagues that work on these issues. So the state of the art is that migration and displacement are being estimated in terms of damages. But you're right that it's certainly not integrated into most of the models that exist, and it is cutting edge. But it's very much something that the current generations of modelers are interested in. And the basic thing is what you're worried about, which is that it's really hard to extrapolate on past information, given that we're looking at situations that are unprecedented. So I think that you're right, that the reason that these haven't been incorporated, these kinds of major displacement events have been incorporated, is because it's just really hard to figure out how to extrapolate on historical data. But it is being done, and I'm happy to point you towards the literature if you're interested.
Great. Thanks.
Just another note here, I did want to kind of just mention that if anyone at any time like either doesn't want to be on audio or video, just feel free to post comments in the chat, and I could just read them to be addressed later. Or if you just want to, use that as an introduction, feel free to add comments in the chat.
I had one quick question. If no one else has anything. So my question is, what's the most effective way I can donate my small charity budget to help the cause? After about half an hour's Googling last year, I concluded that there was some scheme that gave, I think it was liquid gas burning stoves or something like that, to some countries that would otherwise use wood burning stoves, with a quick calculation of the difference of the CO2 output. That's obviously a small CO2 arbitrage that can be performed. I'm sure there's a better idea out there. So have you any thoughts?
Yeah, so this is a question which has been this is a question which has been examined a number of times by several different people and organizations within Effective Altruism. I will follow up after the talk with a link to, there's a Google Doc which the Effective Environmentalism group have been putting together that collects together a bunch of resources, but in particular has a section on recommended charities for donating to, who are particularly effective for tackling climate change. There's maybe like half dozen to a dozen different recommendations, and they all link back to information about why they were thought to be particularly effective. And I think it's worth calling out, and this is kind of an example of this, that we're sort of in the early days of EA engaging with climate change and having concrete recommendations. So like, I think EA kind of got started with beginning to make recommendations in this area back in kind of 2016. Giving What We Can did some analysis, and they, for example, recommended an organization called Cool Earth that carry out essentially, I think it's protecting areas of rainforest, basically, and Giving What We Can did some analysis about whether that was effective. And then interestingly, I think in 2019, a different EA group came along and reviewed the research done by Giving What We Can, which is great. We need more of that kind of stuff. And this group, I think they're called Let's Fund, made a post to the EA forum saying, yeah, no, we looked back at this and we weren't convinced that that Cool Earth are as effective as they were previously thought. And so like there's both evidence and also a bit of like discussion about whether that evidence is or is not as convincing as it was claimed to be. And frankly, I find that more convincing. Like the fact that it's not just some random person said a thing, but someone else has come along and actually reviewed it and like gone back and talked to the organization about it. And like you can see the critique and then giving what, and then Cool Earth have come back and they've got their own response to the critique because they don't fully agree with all of it. And like that seems like a healthy, if frustratingly complicated state of affairs for this kind of reviewing of effective causes to be in.
Yeah, I think that was a good point. I'm glad that we will be sharing some links to learn more on Facebook. Though I did just want to address briefly, Guy, if you or like, would that work for you? Like, are you on Facebook that you could get that, or is there any way that it would be better to connect with you for that?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, so yeah,
okay.
I can read those posts. That'd be cool.
Yeah, so that should be, we'll be posting the shared Google Doc in the event, area for how this event was shared. And that Google Doc has lots more resources.
Cool, thanks.
I see that there was a question from Anders about indirect effects. You talk a lot about indirect effects and unknown unknowns that models don't account for, but couldn't the same be said about other problems, e.g. health and poverty as well? I mean, yes, in many ways it can. We live in like frustratingly complicated world, and much of the way that the world exists today has never existed before, and therefore, again, basically by construction, we're operating a lot of the time on like not quite guesswork, but our like best estimate of how this works. I think this was best exemplified to me recently. There was a post on the EA forum asking the meta question of whether if like direct interventions like action against malaria used to be a thing that was like, oh, that was like very effective. And then subsequent to that, things like Give Directly, we were like, oh, maybe if we just like give people money, they can meet their own needs. And then subsequent to that, some people have stepped forward and being like, but what if we just manage to achieve economic growth? Wouldn't that make everyone richer? And then they could all meet their needs. Maybe that's even more effective than any of this like fiddling down with individual interventions. And there was this incredible comment in the like comment thread on that post that noted that, and I'm going to mess up the details here, but I think it was something like the World Bank had commissioned a study back in I want to say about 2010, 2012 kind of time, where they got a group of about 20 or 30 worldly leading economists who worked for like, I think it was like 2 or 3 years, spending millions of dollars trying to do like absolutely cutting edge research, trying to answer the question of, looking back over the 20th century, why did countries grow? Like in the cases where countries had successful economic growth, why did it happen? And the conclusion of this giant research project with the like top experts in the world was essentially, yeah, we're not sure. We've got a good idea of some things which cause growth not to happen, but once you address those, it's really quite unclear to us what magic sauce causes economic growth to happen, because every like period they looked at seemed to have particular distinct local kind of causes and circumstances. So like, I know this is a large kind of distance from the question you're actually asking, but like the kind of intuition I take from that is that it's very plausible to me that it's very hard to really properly model things like health and poverty, because the world is complicated, and so we will inevitably always apply simple models to it. But I think it's fundamentally harder to model what the world is going to look like with 80 more years of technology development, GDP growth, population growth, and climate change. And the set of effects that all unleashes of changes in weather patterns, temperature, sea level rise, ocean acidification are, I think, quantifiably more complex than trying to figure anything out about how kind of global health and poverty are operating today. But I could be wrong about that. That's just my intuition.
I suppose one of the advantages that the malaria medicine has in terms of its attractiveness to charitable giving versus climate change fighting stuff is that the cost is more easily quantifiable. I mean, how much would a big machine that effectively doubles the planet's carbon sink capacity cost? Is it 1 trillion? Is it 2 trillion? Who the heck knows? But if you could effectively quantify that, then you could more easily compare which is the rational way to allocate capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and like that speaks to the structural point that I was getting at in this talk, in that like I think climate sits in this awkward middle ground for EA, that immediate interventions which you can quantify and be like, I did this thing that helped someone, I can measure that, has a really kind of direct appeal about it, and rightly so. Like anything you try and do in the future is much more uncertain, and so like there's a kind of attraction of the certainty of, I really did buy some malaria bed nets, those really did get delivered to some people, and those really did at the statistical level save some lives. And then at the other end of the spectrum, when you look at like genuine X risks of like, I can imagine that if there was a nuclear war tomorrow, that could actually wipe out humanity. Like if we had a full-scale nuclear arms exchange, that could like just be the end of us. And so like there's lots of uncertainties there, but the stakes are obviously high because they're basically infinite, because it means the end of humanity. Whereas climate sits in this awkward bit in the middle where it's like, we're pretty sure it's going to be pretty incredibly terrible, but we're also pretty sure that the worst of that is going to be a few decades away. It's going to arrive after we've emitted so much CO2 that we will have committed ourselves to a particular outcome probably. But it won't really bite until arguably far too late. I would actually, on this topic, enormously strongly recommend this book, Don't Even Think About It, which is a book on exactly this topic of like, what is it uniquely about climate change that causes humanity to like systematically neglect it and fail to engage with it. Like it's basically the perfect problem for playing into all of our cognitive biases. The Nobel Prize winning economist Daniel Kahneman, who was famous for his book Thinking Fast and Slow, is interviewed in Don't Even Think About It, and depressingly is basically quoted as being like, yeah, I'm very pessimistic. I don't think we're going to solve this problem because it just plays so perfectly into all of our biases. We won't manage to tackle it. And God, I hope he's wrong. But like, I think it's worth taking seriously when Nobel Prize winning economist who looks at like human behavior looks at this problem and goes, you know what, this is exactly what people will just not deal with. That definitely indexes me a bit more towards being like, if I find myself being like, but what if I just don't deal with this? I bet there's other things which are more attractive, then I kind of bias a little bit against that. Not like an unlimited amount, obviously, but a bit.
Yeah, just to comment on that as well. I think possibly climate change represents possibly the greatest market externality in terms of being in the far future and affecting everyone, and no single person can have much of an impact on it. It's like the ultimate version of that, effectively. And you can also see a lot of the neglectedness within EA in some of that context, because at least from my perspective, a lot of free market economics goes into the building blocks of how we analyze these things in EA, including diminishing returns and neglectedness and assumption of efficient distribution of resources building into the neglectedness, sorry, which you had talked about in your post as well. You said that the assumption is that all of the resources applied do not compete with each other, for example. So I think that can all build into neglectedness within EA being underestimated for climate change as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Something else I wanted to ask you about, when you said that one of the criticisms on your post was that it was a bit too one-sided, personally, I didn't think that was particularly fair, because it seemed to me like you were commenting directly on a statement or a body of work that other people had written up. And as such, you didn't really need to restate their points in a positive light, as it were. If you were looking at something that was completely like not looked at, and that there wasn't an original onus of explanation on someone else, then yeah, I can see where that criticism would be fair. But since you're already commenting on someone else's like estimates and their deductions and things, I think it's reasonable to just approach it from the way you did.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I as a meta point, there's definitely, as far as I can tell, a particular style of discourse and thinking which is encouraged within the EA community, and I don't always find it easy to get on with. But I think if I had presented a post which at least did a better job of acknowledging the like amount that EA has paid attention to climate, and like, for example, on 80,000 hours, climate is the fourth top problem, which is fairly prominent. And so like it's not like climate change is ignored, but I think it's neglected versus what it is, versus what it deserves, and particularly in the way that it's talked about. So there's kind of nuance there. And I had like there's one of the comment threads on the post that I had a back and forth with someone whose username I don't have to hand, but where I really just failed to reach a point of agreement with them. But they seem to sort of take the view that because lots of people outside of EA are already engaged with climate change, like apparently it's fairly common experience if you start an EA group is to have lots of people showing up being like, oh my God, I want to do the most good in climate change, which is not the point of EA. It's to like figure out what's the most good to do overall. Although if that happens to be climate is one of the things that we would recommend, then that's okay. And so like, I think it has been a common experience for some EA organizers to feel like they definitely don't need to add more emphasis to climate because it's getting so much elsewhere. But I guess my take on that is that even if the conclusion of EA is that climate is not the most important thing, maybe it's only the like fourth most important thing or whatever it works out to be, I still think it's really important that the information presented by EA about climate is as accurate and kind of aware of the limitations of the evidence that it's using as possible. And I think that's where I see EA as falling down in the past, is that it has either just outright downplayed the risks, or it's tried to like grasp at some of the evidence that does exist and use it even when that has really big like issues, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think your post wasn't really comparing it particularly with the rankings of other cause areas. It was just sort of specifically looking at the claims made about climate change. So yeah, that's why I thought it was quite fair. And I agree that I think it's potentially being misrepresented within EA, and possibly downplayed intentionally or unintentionally. I don't know. Yeah. Well, thanks for answering my questions. It was
Sure,
a really
yeah,
good
of
talk.
course. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess just because it comes to mind, to expand on one kind of detail of that, I think one of the things which I guess I didn't really call out so explicitly in my talk is that one of the things which I observe in not everyone, but some of the people who engage on climate posts within an EA context or talk about climate in an EA context seem to engage from a position of like strong technology optimism and acceptance of technology-driven change and adaptation. That like on my original, I forget which of my first two posts it was either on the review of the 80K problem profile or on the later review of climate cost effectiveness analyses. But I actually got into a discussion with someone in the comments where they were basically arguing, well, you know, this all happens slowly, so we'll have plenty of time to adapt. And so I don't see how this can be so bad. And I was pointing out that some places are just going to get far too hot. And like we've got air conditioning, but that's for enclosed spaces. What about if you want to like go outside and enjoy being outside of buildings? And they genuinely raised the prospect of like, oh, well, you know, I can well imagine people wearing like ice vests or some kind of like vest which burn to fuel to use evaporation to cool the wearer. And I was just like, the worldview where that is an acceptable way of, like, we live in this world which is beautifully easy to live in many places of the world, like temperate, comfortable, and we have a whole bunch of people who live in much hotter places already, but they're already adapted to those hot places. I'm not like delighted about the prospect that London or New York or Seattle could become much hotter, and I'm sure they could adapt because they're fairly rich places, but that doesn't make that adaptation okay. And that just kind of, again, brings me back to, I really get quite skeptical about some of the kind of economic modeling here where it becomes like, oh, well, you know, how much would all the air conditioners cost? And therefore, does that offset some of the harm? Like if air conditioning becomes really affordable, does that mean that climate change is just not that much of an issue? It is kind of, I think, a legitimate stream of thought for some economists. And I guess I'm partially, and to be fully transparent about this, coming from a worldview where like, I don't care if air conditioners are free and take zero resources to produce. If we have to air condition everyone's home through most of the inhabited world to produce a livable environment, and therefore not many people die because we've made air conditioning so cheap, that's not what success looks like to me. That's a terrible outcome, and I really feel like sometimes I feel a bit of a disconnect between my values and my view on the world and some of the people I interact with in an EA context, and I struggle to know what to do with that.
If no one else wants to talk, I'll make a few points. Thanks for your talk. Great. There was one point which I thought might be a bit misleading, which was your just comparison with the total Earth sink, sort of when you sort of had negative technologies compared to that. So that number that you're using is not like the total amount of carbon dioxide absorbed by the Earth net, right? That's just like the absorbed minus the emitted, right? That you're using there. And so that's a strong function of how much carbon we've emitted historically, because that's basically the amount to which we've shifted out of equilibrium. So yeah, I guess that's not necessarily a number I would find helpful. Anyway, on an entirely separate note, thinking about long-termists, what I find surprising is that people don't try and think about X risks as applying to non-human species and like value of biodiversity from a sort of long-termist perspective as another, just any form of like irreversible change being something that you'd expect to value more highly within a long-termist perspective. I wonder if you want to just talk about that a bit.
Yeah, totally. I'd love to speak to both of those points. So on the negative emissions figure, yeah, you make a really good point. The like actual carbon cycle on Earth is of a much larger magnitude than the 20 gigatons a year that I'm saying are being emitted. That's 20 gigatons of human emissions are getting sucked down as part of a much larger process. But I still think it's interesting, at least I find it an interesting comparison to note that the like absorption capacity we would have to build would be equivalent to the absorption capacity of the world in terms of what it absorbs of human emissions. But you're right, that's not the total absorption capacity of the world, which is considerably greater, and that is a very important distinction. On the animal welfare front, that's actually a really interesting one to me, because that's an area which I feel like I only had time to scratch the surface of in the research for this post and then this talk, and then didn't actually end up talking about it at all. But something which I've seen quoted in a couple of analyses of climate impacts by effective altruists is this idea that or this claim that the net impact of climate change on wild animal welfare is unknown in sign, as in we're genuinely unsure whether it's going to be positive or negative overall for wild animal welfare. And from my very surface level reading on this, this looks to be rooted in a kind of utilitarian perspective of, okay, there's going to be lots of animals who will die, but there'll be other animals who flourish more. And so if overall there might end up being more biomass and therefore more individual sentient animals, then it might end up being net positive if you value all sentient animals equally and on the same footing. And like, that's an interesting philosophical point to make, but my like immediate reaction to it, which is rooted in having a particular worldview to begin with, and so I try and like temper a little bit, but like my immediate reaction to that was like, hang on a minute, what about species extinction? Like, I'm pretty sure one of the big concerns of the rapid transformation of the global climate is that there will be a whole bunch of species who simply are not able to adapt quickly enough, because on geological scales we're essentially instantaneously changing the climate. And so like there's a whole bunch of species who will be wiped out by this. And so I take slender comfort in the idea that, oh, well, maybe on net there will be an increase in biomass in other areas, which will make up for that. I wonder if you have any further comments on either of those.
I wasn't really framing it in terms of an animal welfare perspective, actually more from information available to humans. So like just in terms of like a amount of knowledge of how the world works, like we are destroying the ice records of what past temperatures were by melting glaciers, for instance. We are destroying, records of how different species have evolved by doing this. And that's a sort of irreversible loss of information that will then theoretically at least curtail later development.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like it's still the case to this day that we get lots of interesting drug developments by looking at the natural world, because it turns out that millions of years of diversified biological processes produces interesting chemical components and reactions. I mean, let's be clear, I know almost nothing about sourcing of chemicals from natural environments. It's never a thing I've read into, but like superficially, I understand that's a thing which happens. And therefore, superficially, it seems a bad idea for us to go around doing things which would cause large-scale extinctions. And yeah, your point about this being kind of irreversible processes, again, is like not a thing which I see particularly talked about, that when we're talking about, oh, it's not an X risk but for humans, but it is wiping out all of these species. Like, that's not a kind of follow-on bit of the argument which I've seen made particularly prominently.
This is Matt here. Several comments. I think I'll just go to, I think, the ones that are the most crucial considerations here. And that's on, like, I think in the forum post on the EA forum, and I recommend people that are on this call read that forum post, and especially all the comment discussion. I think that was very clear. And I think one point that Will Bradshaw had made is there's a disagreement in the terms of neglectedness, right? And maybe conflating that also with tractability. Like, personally, there's a lot of money and effort going into climate change, just generally as a cause area, not necessarily just within EA. And I think the tractability there for an additional person working on that is probably extremely low, both in terms of dollars donated and amount of money going into that. And I say that as someone that actually works in the cause area. And so I think this question, like, if it's neglected within EA, well, I think EA, like, if it is going to be cause neutral, and like we should be trying to use our limited resources in the way where it's most likely to be tractable. I think that's a really strong strike against working on specifically mitigation focused efforts within climate change, given that it's extremely unlikely that EAs are, I mean, at the best, we might be like 10 times more effective than the best mitigation opportunities that are already extremely well funded by like environmental NGOs. I think there's still a case for some EAs working on analysis of climate change, but I don't think any amount of dollars from the EA community should go to climate change, simply because we can just send our analysis to major environmental organizations. Like, the amount of environmental giving and people that want to give to climate change and don't care about EA stuff, they don't care about global poverty, they don't care about like those human problems and don't think in an EA mindset, like their pool of money and philanthropy is so much bigger that just influencing a small fraction of that, I think is a lot better focus of our analysis efforts than even sending $1 of EA dollars to climate change. Anyways, thoughts on that?
Sure. Just to check, because I didn't see your video earlier, were you on the call during my talk?
Yes.
Cool, perfect. Because yeah, I mean, I agree that, and I said, I noted at the end of my talk that my post was arguably overloading the term neglectedness, and that was an unhelpful distraction, and that arguably a new term is needed there. So I absolutely concede that point. I think it's probably not helpful to take a kind of well-established EA term and try and bend it into a different shape. So totally. On your kind of wider argument about the effectiveness of climate change, I think there's a couple of different parts that are like my key response to that. One is that regardless of whether we think climate is a thing that EA should work on, I think that EA should talk about climate in a competent way. Our like problem profile on 80K hours should be good. It should actually like reflect the best science and not focus only on extreme risks and portray climate change as a thing that you would care about only because of, in this kind of framing of an unlikely but terrible event. Because I think that it's accurate that that is not a like true description of climate change. Like, I'm worried about the mainstream of climate change. I'm worried about us landing on 3 or maybe 4 degrees Celsius of warming, and that will have a serious impact. That's not extreme risks. That's what is currently plausibly predicted to happen. So I think there's a need for EA to like up its game in terms of its communication about climate. And it might still then draw the conclusion that even though there's this very serious problem, look, it's not neglected. Lots of people work on it. And like, that's a strong argument. There are lots of people who work on climate, and I think it's plausible that one extra person working on it is unlikely to make a crucial difference. I think the like key points that I would suggest in response to that would be that treating climate as a monolithic topic is unhelpful. I think that there are fields within it which are genuinely neglected, or I think that it's likely that there are fields within it which are genuinely neglected. I also think there's an interesting argument to be made, which I didn't make in my post, about availability of work on climate change. So if we take some of the other areas that you might work on as an effective altruist, so global priorities research, nuclear security, global pandemics, this is a superficial impression, and so please, anyone on this call who's researched this more, correct me if I'm just wrong. But I get the impression that it's probably quite hard to actually get a job working in exactly those areas, that there's probably a relatively limited number of think tanks with a relatively limited number of jobs, or relatively limited number of positions within like government agencies to work on those types of roles. However, climate is this kind of ridiculously all-pervasive issue where like basically every country around the world, not every, well yes, every country, but every city, every building, every company around the world needs to figure out how it's getting to net zero in the next 30 years. And so the odds that you work for a company that you could try and have some influence in about their climate policy is non-zero. And you get some like weird, interesting companies around the world, kind of, I would say, taking like interesting leadership positions. Stripe is a payment company, but their climate position is really interesting, where they've made a public commitment to not just offset their emissions, but also to buy into negative emissions technologies, currently at any price, up to a maximum annual budget of like $5 million a year or something. So like, it's not a giant fund of money, but like they're making that position publicly because that's just the right thing for a company that has some money to do, to be like, how can we throw our weight behind some technology development? We make it clear that we would buy this service. So I've grasped at some arguments. Do you find any of them at all convincing? Like maybe they're just not at all, and I'm prepared to believe that.
Yeah, well, I think I want to focus more. You mentioned there are parts that you think sub areas within climate change that needed more analysis. Mm-hmm. Which ones in particular did you think that was the case for?
So if I had a really good answer to that question, then that would probably be an incredibly valuable thing to have. But I'll do my best to give my like best guess based on the like casual research I've done in the last year and a bit. So it's not, I don't have visibility. It could be the case, but I don't have visibility into whether grids are becoming smart enough, fast enough. Like, are technologies for making like grid level smart use of electricity getting rolled out at scale quickly? I'm aware of some, because I looked into this to potentially be a career that I could move into myself. I'm aware of a couple of companies, one in the UK and one in Belgium who are working on smart grid technology that on a real-time basis would reach into like industrial facilities, particularly things like industrial fridges, and switch them off in real time when the grid had less power available. That sounds like a really important addition to making the grid more flexible. And I have no idea whether the technology is being developed fast enough and with a vision to roll it out at large enough scale to make as much impact as it should have. So that's an area that I would grasp at. Negative emissions technologies seem like they really, given how much faith we're putting in them and how big we need them to get, it seems likely to me that there aren't enough people working on them. Like I'm aware of somewhere between maybe about half a dozen companies who are working on it. But do I believe that they've got all the funding that they could absorb to do their work as quickly and effectively as they could do? Somehow I doubt it. So those are a couple of things which I would grab at, but like getting a really good answer on like what are the key areas which are neglected within climate change, I think would be a great thing to be done by effective altruists. And it's a thing which some people have been trying to work on. I know that, I think is it Let's Fund who did some research and concluded.
Hildebrand, and Let's Fund, they've done that analysis. And the Founders Pledge people have done a similar analysis. Negative emissions features prominently in their results. I do agree with that assessment. And I think that's the case where that's a government funded need. That actually is getting more attention. There's some recent proposals even released by the DOE these past 2 weeks, funding in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollar range for negative emissions tech.
Nice.
So yeah, as far as grid stuff, working on that, I think the research on that is growing about as fast. Like the funding is not a limitation. It like the research capacity is about growing as fast as you could expect a research capacity in a field to grow. So yeah, whether that should be faster, like I mean, there's a question of how you make science advance faster, and with money is not a limitation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but those are 2 points. Does anyone else have other questions?
Yeah, we probably do have time for a few more. I mean, if no one else has anything, I was kind of curious. It was interesting to hear you compared negative emissions to nuclear fusion. And I was curious if you had any thoughts. And then there's another time in your discussion where you mentioned that like carbon emissions are like at least very long standing in the atmosphere, like potentially hundreds of years. But I was curious, like, are you really so pessimistic that you think like even, you know, maybe not within 100 years, but like even within 200 years, you think it's like what would you say is the likelihood that within 200 years we would not discover negative emissions technology?
I see. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and it asks me, as so many of these questions do, to predict 80 years into the future. So I will have a crack at doing that with all the usual caveats. I try to pay a lot of attention to the fact that the world we live in today is just enormously transformed from the world that existed 100 years ago, particularly in terms of technology. And so that gives me a basic intuition that we should expect technology to change pretty rapidly. And so the technology that will exist 80 years from now, if I just try and naively imagine, oh, it'll just be like this, but I'm a bit older, I'm probably wrong. But it's very hard to know what it will be like. And so I think I would assume that at some point we will crack negative emissions technology at scale. And so all of the kind of claims that CO2 persists in the atmosphere for hundreds of years are likely not true in practice, because hopefully within the next 50 to 150 to maybe 200 years, we will deploy technology at scale to re-geoengineer our Earth back down to a sensible temperature. But the like really interesting question, which I think is firmly in the unknowable territory, is whether we will push the world into a sufficiently bad territory in the interim period that the impacts on organized society will be sufficiently severe that our like large-scale research, development, and industrial like manufacturing and deployment capacity will in some way be curtailed. Like maybe we're looking at 80 to 100 years of pretty rough times on Earth, where lots of people suffer and die from an arguably avoidable cause. And then we manage to muster enough technology to sort that out, and we'll pat ourselves on the back and be like, my God, that technology we deployed was incredibly high impact. Look at the number of lives we saved. And hopefully try not to think too hard about the fact that we put ourselves in that situation in the first case. Or in the next like 20, 30 years, the world will continue to get very, very interested and excited about climate change and like beat itself into shape, and will like flatten that curve of emissions down to the point where like maybe it's only moderately terrible rather than extremely terrible. Or it gets pretty bad towards the end of the century, and so bad that a bunch of the stuff which I've hand-waved at through this talk, and I'll continue to hand-wave furiously at, happens together, mutually reinforces, and bad stuff happens. And like, there's a whole community of people online who are convinced that that's the future that we're heading for. And I don't count myself a member of that community, but like, I can see the thread of plausibility that gets them so depressed about the future, and I cannot rule that out. I cannot like look at the facts and be like, yeah, no, that's definitely not the future we're heading for. So like, I don't think I've answered your question. I think I've given you like 3 possible pathways to the future, and I don't think I would be I don't think I'd like to try and put a kind of percentage chance on each of them. I think some variant of the middle one is probably the most likely. I probably don't have a great deal of faith that we're going to like limit climate change particularly effectively, but I think we probably will limit it before it like drastically and permanently curtails civilization. So over the like term of a small number of centuries, we probably will re-engineer our world back to a sensible temperature, because we're pretty smart like that, and we will have merely wrought an enormous amount of havoc over an enormous scale of the planet for, I don't know, like a century or something.
I could speak a little bit more to the negative emissions tech. There's a few demonstrated technologies that already have demonstration projects out. And I think there's 2 points. There's like say direct air capture, and then there's actually storage of the carbon that you capture. I think right now the tech itself for direct air capture and other sorts of capturing of carbon dioxide, I think it's at the stage where you just need to bring costs down, right? It's around the like $400, $300 to $500 range per ton of carbon. So that's not viable. Like even with a carbon price, carbon price is only going to be around like probably $50 to $100 per ton. So that's not enough to make those technologies viable, and they can't like scale the costs down. I think there is a question of storage and places where you can actually store captured carbon dioxide. And it does reach the point where if you store a lot of it in things like used oil formations or underground caverns and that sorts of things, where the potential leakage rate actually gets relatively high. And so you reach this sort of concern of like, where do you put all that carbon? And I think that's where a lot of the technology development needs to happen.
I just point out that this is a fundamentally different problem too with when you've got sort of nuclear fusion, because with that you have an energy imbalance, right? So like, it doesn't matter how much money you put in if you don't get any energy out of it. It's only once you've got to positive net output of energy that you get anything at all worth putting money into. Whereas with negative emissions technology, we already have some carbon stored. It's not that you don't actually store any carbon with all of the existing technologies that we have that we just mentioned there.
Sure. I mean, I guess I would argue that whilst that's kind of real distinction, on a practical basis, it doesn't feel like it makes that much of a difference, given that if the carbon capture is too expensive to deploy at the scale that we need, then it's not practically different from the technology simply not existing.
Well, it's different because we see, and recently we've been seeing continuous exponential growth in the application scale. And so you're talking about increase and decrease. So there's a paper came out recently, I'll send links to it if you want, sort of analyzing sort of 8% growth per year in carbon capture and storage technology, and how that's maybe a little bit too small to reach a lot of these targets, but you wouldn't need to increase it by many orders of magnitude, but we're discussing sort of like changes in the order of magnitude of growth, rather than something where you have to reach a limit and then suddenly, only then do you even care about the economics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the technology existing is rather significant. Like if it's not possible, I think that like if negative emissions technology just weren't physically possible, then that would change the significance of this quite substantially, right? If it's a matter of economics, then it's, yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I definitely retract my previous claim that they were the same. It definitely is significant that we have the technology.
Yeah.
I do, sorry to interrupt everyone. Actually, just like meta, I do actually have to go. If anyone is okay with me like making someone else the host, oops, I think I could do that. But
sure.
yeah, I just am not available to continue. And if anyone has to hop off, it has been quite a good discussion.
Presumably, if you're recording locally, you'll need to stop that, and then anything that we continue to discuss will be off the recording, which I think is fine at this point.
Yeah, I think that is going to happen. Okay, so Martin, is it okay if I make you host, or would that work?
Yeah,